Hi all, welcome back. HUK here with another vid of games that I have played. As we're heading up towards Halloween 2020, a year that has effectively been Halloween all year round, let's be honest. I thought I'd continue with the World of Darkness games. Today touching upon the oh-so-spooky Wraith the Oblivion. So Wraith the Oblivion uses the same system, storyteller system that Vampire, Werewolf and the others use. I covered this under the Vampire the Masquerade video, so I won't go over it again. The concept of Wraith is that you play a dead person. You are a ghost, hence Wraith. Which is both an interesting concept and a bit of an odd one, to be honest. The system does have a couple of interesting things in it that differentiate it from the other games and also tie into this particular concept. The first is that you have to determine how you died, because that's relevant both to your character backstory and to something I'm going to talk about in a minute called a feta. So how you died sort of determines somewhat of your character. Well, that's how they try and put it anyway. I mean, we had a couple of interesting ones. I had 3 players when we did Wraith. We only did one Chronicle. It was a fairly short one, to be fair. Much like everything outside of Masquerade. I can't remember what one of the guys played, but I remember my friend JP played a character who was a banker or accountant or something like that, and it all went pear-shaped for him. And he threw himself out of a 10th story window and took his own life. Lost all his money, that sort of thing. And one of the other guys, Paulie, who you may remember I mentioned from the Werewolf the Apocalypse videos, played a guy who was just driving home from work when some idiot fell from a 10th story window and smacked into his bonnet, put him into a wall, and the two of them died together, sort of thing. So their characters were kind of linked, which was kind of nice. The 2 players worked together to sort of come up with that backstory. And this is where fetas come in. Your character is tied to a feta. So a feta can be a place, an object, or a person. Kind of think of it as like the shade of your Aunt Mabel. It doesn't matter where her favourite lampstand goes, her spirit always seems to be there. That's because that's her feta. You are tied to a place. Doesn't mean you can't go away from it. It just means that when something happens to your character, to your spiritual self, the equivalent of being killed in a normal game, you get drawn back to your feta and you have to inhabit it for a while you rebuild your essence, as it were. Which makes it really awkward when if you link yourself to a person. So I don't think people really do it. They link themselves to places or objects. The other thing, and we never really bothered with this because it ended up being a little bit awkward, there is a rule or a mechanic called the shadow. The shadow. And the shadow is a really weird thing. It's the idea that basically as a dead person, your ego, your drives, the thing in the back of your head that kind of gets you to do things, isn't bound anymore. You don't have your humanity. I'm going to say humanity, but that's not quite the right word. But you don't have that force of will that the living have to basically push those dark thoughts to the back and get on with things. And the shadow can be used to make things difficult for you. The reason it doesn't really work is because the shadow is... Your shadow is created and played by another player at the table. And quite frankly, it either leads to one of 2 things. Either that player will take it too far and really screw things over for you, or they won't feel comfortable with it and they won't do anything with it. And then you have the possibility that the GM, the storyteller, has to take control of it. But the problem is the storyteller's got other things to be doing in the game, to be worrying about all that. So we just dropped Shadow after so long. We just, occasionally as a storyteller, I would just sort of like use something from it to make things slightly difficult, but I wouldn't. We didn't focus on it. The other nice thing is you don't have like a wound system. You had something called corpus, which is kind of your ectoplasmic bad self. And I kind of like the mechanic for this. So when you took an injury of some description, it came off of your corpus. If your corpus is 0, you basically get flung back to your feta until you can recover some corpus. So how would you take damage? Well, obviously other spiritual entities can cause you corpus damage, but the spooky thing of ghosts walking through walls and doors is quite interesting, because if you do that, you leave part of your ectoplasmic self behind, thus taking corpus damage. Walking through a solid object is not a pleasant experience. This also led to something that was kind of, I think, hinted in the rules, but I did use once or twice to try and confine the characters to an area, and that is that something passing through you also deals damage. So when you wanted to keep some people, in the haunted house or in the whatever, you made it rain, because anyone going outside was basically being shot by an Uzi. Which is very nasty. So they could use it as an escape, but it put them in a bad position. They were better off staying put. So the game had some interesting mechanics. It was the setting that didn't kind of work. You kind of had two worlds. You had like an ethereal realm. I can't remember the names of these things, but you had like an ethereal realm which was overlaid the real living world, and that's where most spirits, most shades, most wraiths congregated. That's where they dwelt. But if I remember correctly, there was like an underworld, or a series of underworlds, one for each sort of culture or corner of the globe. So Japan had its own sort of underworld, China would have its own, the Philippines have its own, Greece would have its own. It was very similar to sort of like a Hades or something like that. But generally, Western world had something called Stygia, which was like, it never really clarified. It was like a giant city of the dead ruled over by death, basically. Charon or Sharon or whatever you want to call him, that sort of figure. And these various underworlds would wage war on one another, and it's much like any other game outside of Masquerade. It's kind of like they take this cool concept of a game, of a supernatural manifestation, vampires, werewolves, whatever, and then they basically mess with it, and it doesn't come across the way it should. I suppose it's to try and keep things interesting, but in the case of Wraith, it didn't really work. We didn't really want to deal with that. We played in the real world, but how do you deal with that? What stories can you tell as a dead person? What is the society of the dead? Because they didn't have anything like vampire has or werewolf has, or even mage. There were entities that sort of governed things, but there was no politics or anything like that. And I think this was one of the reasons why, when we did a campaign, it lasted probably 7 or 8 sessions, and then that was it. We kind of used the Wraith rules for ghosts in vampire games. It was an interesting concept, but much like Mage the Ascension, you kind of had to really get the new and odd setting for the game if you were going to get any real momentum or enjoyment out of it. And that's kind of it, I think. Wraith had some really cool mechanics, some interesting ideas, but generally the play of the game didn't work. I suppose it's the same thing as I said with Mage. So it didn't sit well with us ultimately, although we kind of enjoyed it a little bit. So have any of you guys played Wraith? What did you think of it? What were your experiences? Did you enjoy it? What, by sounds of it, were we doing wrong? Let me know in the comments down below. And I look forward to talking to you on the next vid. Anyway, take care. Good gaming.